Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I'll be reading chapter 24. And this will be broken into two relatively short videos. Wysteria, chapter 24. Despite the attack, Will was in an upbeat mood today. He'd encountered and defeated a powerful enemy, a superhuman foe. It had been a clear victory, and he'd won the battle using his newly discovered abilities. Will had to assume the war wasn't over, but he was confident his skills would improve each day. Soon, he believed, no dreamer would be able to challenge him on his home turf. The attempt to kidnap Emily, while disturbing, wasn't altogether a surprise. Will thought he would have more time to prepare, that Jeremy might be able to give them some warning. But he had a strong suspicion that Nathan would try to come after her, at some point, in some manner. And now that the skirmish was over, he felt a sense of relief. Tonight, he and Emily could practice the body control exercise Jeremy had shown them. And perhaps they could try skipping together, short trips from one familiar location to another. As Jeremy had told them, Will's task was to learn how to enter the darkness voluntarily and remain awake, for that was the initial step in traveling, no matter the length of the trip. Will had journeyed through the emptiness once, but he'd needed Jeremy's nudge to leave his world, and Emily's hand to keep him from returning to his bed. Although, there was another time when, it seemed, he'd spent conscious moments in the dark. The night he'd rebounded from the square to the castle grounds, using Emily as a beacon. He still wasn't sure that it qualified as traveling, that he'd actually left his world during the bounce. But whatever it was, the experience had prompted both Emily and Jeremy to wonder whether he might be able to travel. Settling into bed that night, Will decided to attempt another touch-and-go landing, waking up in one location, then redirecting himself to another. Not to Emily, though, for she might not be there, but to a particular place. It seemed like a good way to practice moving in and out of the darkness. Will could now emerge in Wysteria wherever he chose, but it required preparation, focusing his attention on the point of entry before going to sleep. This meant that changing locations would be difficult, for he couldn't begin visualizing his final destination until after he'd begun to wake up in Wysteria. It would have to be done very quickly. I should choose a place I know well, he thought. His room at the castle, perhaps? The upper terrace in the garden? No, the fountain, his anchor, his primal connection to Wysteria. He should be able to latch onto it instinctively. After thinking about it for a time, he settled on a plan. He would aim for one of the ponds near the center of the garden. Then, before his body could fully form, he would shift his attention to the fountain, fall back into the dark, and tunnel, if it could be called that, to the new target. "Okay, let's see what happens," he said, closing his eyes. Will began to see shadowy forms. He was waking up, but more slowly than usual. As color and light pushed through the darkness, he felt the ground becoming firm beneath his feet. Gathering his wits, he reminded himself of tonight's objective, the fountain. Go to the fountain. He hovered there, in a dusky haze, trying to retreat, focusing on his anchor. But the scene around him remained and was gradually gaining solidity. Then Will heard a voice, a woman's voice, strangely familiar, softly calling, "This way." It came not from the landscape appearing before him, but from somewhere far in the distance, from within the darkness, from inside him. "This way," he heard again. "It's her," he gasped. It was the blonde woman who, in his very first dream, had guided him to the town square and the fountain. As Will focused his attention on the sound of her voice, the scene darkened. There was stillness, then a brief sensation of movement, and then the sound of water splashing. And when the dark veil lifted, he found himself standing in the plaza, facing the fountain. After gazing for a moment at the tumbling shards of light, he drew a satisfied breath, turned, and began looking for the woman whose call had helped lead him here. Though the fountain was particularly brilliant, it took a moment for the rest of the square to brighten and come into focus. And then he saw her, standing just inside the eastern entrance, looking his way. As their eyes met, she smiled, nodded, then turned and left the square through the gateway, drawing behind her a wispy stream of colored light. Watching her as she walked down the street, and wondering whether he should follow, Will began moving toward the exit, still deliberating, when a fragrance, sweet and purple, swept through his mind. He stopped and looked to his right, the direction in which he felt Emily's presence. Though nowhere in sight, she was close. What should I do? Look for Emily or pursue her? He asked himself. But glancing back through the eastern gateway, he found that his mysterious guide had vanished. He'd looked away for only a moment, and there were no side streets she could have reached in such a short time. Should he run down the street, knocking on doors and questioning citizens? No, he thought. It would be pointless. She was gone. Besides, he was anxious to see Emily and tell her everything that had happened. Reluctantly, Will turned and began walking toward the southern exit. He assumed Emily was down in the garden, but as he came to the gate, he spotted her at the end of the boulevard, walking his way, grinning as she saw him. Each hurrying toward the other, they met in a deep embrace. "I thought you might be up here," she said. "Did you drop in on Lily?" "No. But I saw the blonde woman," Will told her. "Just briefly, though." "You talked to her?" she asked. "I didn't get the chance," he replied. "But I think she spoke to me. She helped me find my way to the fountain. Again." Emily gave him a puzzled look. "Sorry," he said. "I guess I need to explain." Taking arms, they processed down the street away from the square, while Will gave her a quick summary of what had taken place, from his attempt to skip to the fountain, to the blonde woman's sudden disappearance. "Still no clue who she is?" Emily asked, once he'd finished. "No," he said. "Do you want to go back and look for her?" she asked, as they reached the end of the road and stood by the garden doors. Will shook his head. "She could be anywhere by now. And I have a feeling she'll show herself again." They stepped through the doorway and crossed the terrace, then took a seat on the bench near the western railing. "I'll be curious to see what Jeremy has to say," said Emily. "About the blonde woman?" Will asked. "About all of it," she replied. "I wonder what he'll think about yesterday's attack," he said. "Do you think he might have heard about it from one of his sources?" "I don't know. Our guests might not have told anyone about their visit here." "You don't think they'll report back to Nathan?" he asked. "I don't think they're Nathan's men," she said. "They're not drifters, like those other two gentlemen you beat up." "Because of the way they were dressed. They could have been in disguise," he pointed out. "It's possible," she acknowledged. "But I don't think those were disguises. They both looked too comfortable in what they were wearing. The talkative one sure seemed attached to that hat. And it's not just their clothes, it's the way they acted. But whether or not they're gang members or not, there has to be some connection between their attack and Nathan," he said. "Yes, I suppose so," she conceded. "Maybe Charlotte knows something about them. Did you try to contact her?" he asked. "No, I decided to wait," she said. "Why?" "I don't know," she answered. "I'm just not sure what to think right now. I trust her, but—" "I understand," he said. "I don't want to jump to any conclusions, but it's probably a good idea to be careful. We might want to talk to Jeremy first. He might have some answers, or at least some advice." "But if Charlotte shows up, what should we say to her?" Emily asked him. "Should we tell her what the stranger said, that he knew her, or that Lily warned you about her?" "I don't know," he replied, putting his arm around her. "We'll see what she says first. There's probably a perfectly good explanation for everything." Emily nodded in agreement. So, that was the end of part 1, and we will return immediately with part 2.